Who are the biggest winners of Utah spring football so far, and which players could use a big week right before the spring game? We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We're available on all platforms, including YouTube. If this is your guys' first time listening to us, make sure you guys like and subscribe. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Utes or me at JT Wistrcill. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. And on today's show, we're going to be diving into the biggest winners of spring ball so far and which players could really use a big week leading up to the spring game and in the spring game itself. And in order to help me discuss all of that, it's friend of the show and UteZone contributor, Dante Guardi. And Dante, talk about the biggest winners. I got to start with the guy who's winner slash surprise, honestly, because this is a guy that, yes, we knew the quarterback race would be the thing heading into spring ball that everyone was going to talk about. But I really thought it was going to be Nate Johnson or Bryson Barnes. And then pretty much after the very first practice, it was pretty clear that Brandon Rose has been the guy. It's even become now where Bryson Barnes is nipping at Brandon Rose's heels. It's crazy how this whole situation has played out. And I have been so impressed by what we've seen from Brandon in the open practice proportions. He's looked pretty good overall. He, like I said, looked like the best guy so far. So to me, he's the winner because at this moment, he's probably the guy who's going to win the backup quarterback job.
Bryson nipping at his heels is very surprising to me, honestly, because I did not think that we would be in that sort of position at this time. I think no matter what happens, Bryson will end up being like the second or third string regardless, because of how solid he was in that Washington State game last season. You know, that was a very tough situation to come into. You don't know you're going to be starting Cam Rising. All of a sudden gets ruled out last minute, and he comes in, makes some really nice throws, wins a game, wins a tough game on the road coming off a short week after that gritty USC win too, and a tough kind of trappy spot up at Washington State. So, I mean, we've seen what Bryson can do. We know his game. We know he's going to be solid as a backup, but I would not be comfortable with him in a starting position. It's going to be interesting to see how he performs in the spring game, because like if he were to go out there and just be so much better than Brandon Rose and Nate Johnson, then it would be kind of like undeniable at that point. You got to make him the second string. Like, he's been there longer. He knows the playbook more, and he's obviously playing better than both Brandon and Nate Johnson. So at that point, you have to make him the second string regardless. But as for now, I mean, this quarterback race is very, very tricky, because the spring game is going to tell us a lot. The spring game, I think, is going to tell us the most out of anything, because I think we need to see Nate Johnson in game action, because I think that his skill set kind of tailors towards that rather than a practice setting, because of how good he is with his feet, how good he is at extending plays, moving out of the pocket, doing that sort of thing, and just overall being an explosive playmaker, which is what Utah has had over the last few years at quarterback. You know, you see Cameron Rising. You remember that run that he had against Ohio State in the Rose Bowl on that 4th and 1 when he broke it off for 50-plus yards. Tyler Huntley was one of the best rushing quarterbacks in the Pac-12 pretty much his entire career while he was at Utah. So another playmaking quarterback is what Utah needs. And I think in terms of, in that sense, in that term of playmaking ability, I think Nate Johnson has the highest ceiling that we can see in the spring game. But it's going to be interesting to see how he plays in terms of like turnovers and overall just like being on time and the repetition and the overall fluidity of the offense. You know, I think that's where we see Bryson having a leg up on these guys, just because he's been there longer and he understands the playbook more, has seen some real game action, you know, played in 2 Rose Bowls, obviously got that win at Washington State, like I mentioned. So this quarterback race is very interesting, but it's going to be fun to see how it shakes out towards the end, because honestly, nobody really knows where we're at right now in terms of who's going to be the starting quarterback week 1.
Yeah, it's a crazy situation when it does feel weird when you say, like, well, look at what Bryson's done. He still won games for this team. Like, you know what Bryson is. You feel good about that. But if Brandon just looks better than him in practice and leading up to fall camp, then you do have to make him. But it is kind of that unknown, like, man, we're going to be starting a true sophomore against an SEC team coming into our house, like putting our home winning streak on the line. So definitely a decision Kyle Whittingham has to make. And it's nice that he get this spring atmosphere and environment with all the fans coming out and everyone, and just in this kind of the closest you can get to a game situation without actually playing in a game, basically, that they're going to have this opportunity to work it out in practice in front of us. So Brandon has been the biggest winner to me, but another guy, and I arguably who's been one of the best players in general, just from the media portions of what we've seen, is Justin Medlock. I mean, Justin Medlock, when he came in, he was a guy who had a lot of hype. So I remember Coach Scally talking about what a hard hitter he was and how excited they were to get this guy in. And unfortunately for him, there was another pretty good freshman in his class named Lander Barton. So you factor Lander in, Karene Reed coming back as a starter, Mahmoud Diabate transferring over from Florida, and there just wasn't any room for Medlock last season. And in spring ball, there's room for him because the transfer they had this year, Leavani Damuni, can't come over until the summer. So he's been the third linebacker, and he has looked absolutely sensational. He's a gap shooter, hard hitter, really physical, just flies all over the ball. Good job containing the edge when he needs to, takes good angles. I'm a huge fan of his. And last year we really saw Utah only roll with 3 linebackers. I think that's going to change a little bit this year. And I think even if Damuni comes in and looks is everything this team wants him to be, I still think Medlock will find a way to make it out on the field because he's just looked that good in practice.
Yeah, this linebacker room is going to be really exciting to watch, mainly because you got a lot of different personalities, a lot of different play styles within it, and they all excel at different things, which is going to make for just a really well-rounded, solid room, which will probably be not only the deepest, but arguably the most talented in the conference when you take into account the level of recruits that Utah has brought in at linebacker, and not to mention Leavani Damuni, who's coming in over the summer, like you mentioned, who was extremely good in coverage last year. So that's the main thing I want to touch on. So Leavani Damuni is very experienced. He's been a multi-year starter, was the best player on Stanford's defense last season, hands down. And now with this Utah room, he's coming in to a Utah room that's a little bit younger. You know, Karene Reed has gotten some significant playing time over the last 2 or 3 seasons, no doubt. But Lander Barton, only 1 season. Justin Medlock hasn't really seen any significant playing time. And as good as Justin Medlock has looked, I'd be shocked to see him come in and just completely dominate early on just because he's so young. The talent's there. We're going to see him progress throughout the season, and I think that's going to be a really encouraging sign. But early on, I would not be shocked to see him struggle a little bit when it comes to overrunning on run plays and just minor lapses in coverage. But I think that's where Leavani Damuni is really going to excel because of the experience that he has coming in and how good he already is in coverage. Not to mention that he's going to be playing with players who are exponentially better than the ones he was playing next to at Stanford. This Utah defense is loaded compared to what he was playing with at Stanford. So now he's playing with better people. He is what he was the best player on that Stanford defense. I mean, this linebacker room is going to be electric. You got Lander Barton coming off the edge. You know, he's a hard hitter. Karene Reed has been solid in coverage throughout his career, has been a good pass rusher as well, just does it all. And now you got Justin Medlock, who's got loads of talent, and Leavani Damuni, who's got experience and is great in coverage. It's going to be a really well-rounded, really fun to watch room that's going to kind of hold together this Utah defense, kind of act as the glue and really just keep them together during those stretch of the season when you kind of get fatigued, you know, because that's where the depth really comes into play. And I think that's where Utah is going to excel in the later parts of the season.
The Utah front seven was one of the weaknesses of this team last season, I thought, at a lot of different points in the season. And the other group I was going to mention is the winners for spring ball is the defensive line, because Junior Jafuna, Logan Fano, what we've seen from him, Jonas Ellis, Likibai Mahi, Samote Pepa's a guy we know what he can do too. It just those are the other winners I was going to say. But just in general, the front seven is going to be a strength of this team, I think. And the secondary, yes, they'll be a little weaker just because they lost Clark Phillips, but I feel like Sione Vaki is going to be, I mean, there's a really good chance he's even better than RJ Huber was last year. I'm not trying to say like the very first game he's going to be, just because, look, Huber did have his up and downs, but he's been a long time guy. But just the flashes we've seen from Vaki have been really special. So I think he's going to end the season being even better. Cole Bishop will be better another year. The secondary is loaded with talent. So I just feel really good about this Utah defense in general, Dante. And were there any other big winners you've had from spring ball so far, just from what you've heard?
Not really. I think you kind of hit on all the main points. The defense is really where my emphasis has been over the past few weeks, because I do really think we're going to see them explode, and it's going to be just so much fun to watch. I touched on it last week, how I felt like we kind of got robbed with a bunch of injuries and inexperience and stuff like that. And they didn't really have a lot of time to gel. And when they did have time to gel, we saw them just dominate the back end of the year outside of the Penn State game, where it was really only 2 chunk plays that killed them. But I mean, this is going to be such a fun defense to watch. Like, simply put, there's so much talent, so much experience now, a lot of depth. It's going to be crazy. And I think that's going to be a really strong point for Utah, especially in a Pac-12 conference that has quarterbacks such as Caleb Williams, Michael Penix Jr., Bo Nix, now DJ Uiagalelei, who is one of the most highly touted high school prospects of all time. Obviously wasn't very good at Clemson, but you never know. Maybe something can happen at Oregon State. We've seen them be very close to just getting over that hump, and we've always known they're a quarterback away, and now maybe they found theirs. You never know. So a lot of great quarterbacks in this conference, and I think Utah's defense is probably the best defense in the Pac-12 when it comes to these high leverage games. When it comes to at Washington, at USC, at home versus Oregon, I think Utah's defense is going to be one of the big factors that gets them a couple of wins.
I feel the same way. I feel like they should be the best unit. I feel like they will end up being the best unit, but it's going to be fun to see how it plays out. It'll be good to watch them in action this Saturday at the spring game. Speaking of that spring game, those are kind of the winners we have so far. We're going to talk about a couple of the guys who could really use a big week and just use a big spring game as well in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you guys about our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Grand slams, no hitters, and double plays are back, and there's no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, sign up and place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if you don't win. You can bet on things like a pitcher to go over on strikeouts, build your same-game parlay with your favorite matchup of the day, and all kinds of different things you can make for any of the big MLB games. So don't miss a chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Dante, now let's talk about a couple of the guys who, as we said, these guys it's not like they're the winners versus losers. That's not what this is. This is just guys who could use a big week to kind of put themselves back in certain races or just kind of like assure us like about their position and how we feel about them kind of going into fall camp at the moment. And I think the first two guys I'll look at is Bryson Barnes and Nate Johnson. Now, I want to say Nate Johnson first with an asterisk because he's been dealing with injuries. So we haven't been able to see. We saw him a little bit those first couple weeks, and then after that, he's been banged up. So we haven't really been able to see. So who knows if he'll even go this week. And even if he's able to, I don't know if it's fair to judge him this week, but he's a guy just in terms of, hey, what is he vying for? Quarterback 2, he could use a big week because we have heard about the separation. And at the moment, just from what Coach Witt has said, it sounds like it is Brandon Rose, Bryson Barnes, Nate Johnson. So Nate Johnson to me could use a big week just because of some of those injuries, but I'm not going to overreact if he's not even able to go out there and play because, like we said, he's been hurt and there's still a lot of time with fall camp and everything for him to get up to speed. And then Bryson is the other one because we all assumed that Bryson was the favorite to be the backup. Yes, the backup job drew some intrigue just because he didn't look great against Penn State. But look, that Penn State defensive line was having their way with the Utah offensive line. And we know what Bryson Barnes is. He's a capable player to a team. He can help a team succeed. He can't put a team on his back. So I think that's where for Bryson, I think it would help him to have a big week to show the coaches like, hey, I can be better than you guys think I am, because this is a Utah coaching staff that basically said, hey, Bryson, we're going to make this about Nate versus Brandon Rose because we already know who you are going into spring ball. And now because of the Nate injury, I think Bryson has seen an increase in some reps, and it's a good opportunity for him to capitalize on it. So I think both these guys could use a big week in terms of trying to get back in the race for QB2 because at the moment, they're both in second and third right now, just from what we've heard from Kyle Whittingham.
Yeah, the other group that I kind of want to mention is the offensive line. You know, Jaron Crump,
that was my second
center, Satalo Mea, obviously moving to left tackle, and those two positions are more like the vocal leaders on the offensive line. You know, Jaron Crump being the center hasn't played that position, like being the main center ever since he came to Utah. So,
yeah, never in his career, honestly. He didn't do it in high school either. To your point.
Exactly. So, I mean, definitely a lot of different factors coming into this move. And I think if he's able to just come out and dominate, it'll be very reassuring to Utah fans, very similarly to Satalo Mea. You know, we've seen him over the course of the last couple of years have some pretty bad performances in pass pro. But if he's able to come out this week in the spring game and just dominate these very good Utah defensive ends and just show Utah fans that it's all going to be okay, that I think that this Utah offense, the sky's the limit, honestly, because the offensive line, I think right now is kind of just like the last aspect of the offense that just needs some assurance. You know, we know that when Cam Rising's back, he's going to be very good. The wide receivers, tight ends, the targets, they're going to be very good. The running backs, the room is deep. The room is electric. It's going to be fine. We see Jaquin Jackson, Mekhi Bernard's coming back as well. Like a lot to be excited about within that running back room. Whereas the offensive line, we don't really know. You know, there's a couple of question marks. And I think if Satalo Mea and Jaron Crump are able to dominate this week at practice, it's going to be very assuring for Utah fans, and especially them going up against this defensive line that you and I both think is going to be very good. And they have players that are returning who have been perennial pass rushers in the Pac-12 who have been solid for multiple years. So if they're able to go out and dominate against them, I'll be pretty confident that they'll be able to go out and dominate against similar competition when it comes time to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head when you talk about how good you feel about this team fully healthy. You like Cam Rising. You like Brant Keithy. You like Thomas Yasmin. You like Devon Valen. You like what Money Parks can do. You like what the running backs can do. And we just talked about the defense and how good we feel about those guys. And if the biggest thing is like they don't have a Clark Phillips, like Clark Phillips is really dang good. They still got a bunch of other guys, a Miles Vaughn and Devon Bailey, JT Broughton, that you feel good about in the secondary. And that's not even including some young players who are going to come in, and Smith Snowden and CJ Blocker too, who could factor into their rotation. So you really feel good about all these aspects. And the offensive line is really the one big question mark. And yeah, the team returns 3 starters, but you look at Satala, I mean, yes, he was still an awesome run blocker for this team at right tackle, but definitely had his ups and downs in pass protection. So if he slides over to the left side, that's still going to be a little bit of a transition. Falcon Kalmatule, especially during the scrimmage they had, the media was able to go to a couple weeks ago, it sounds like he really struggled against the Utah D-line, and that's going to be a concern because while we still think this Utah D-line is going to be, like we said, we think it's going to be one of the best in the Pac-12, there's going to be there's other defensive lines that are going to have a lot of talent on it too, so that'll be a concern. I mean, Keaton Bills is the guy I probably feel the best about right now. Jaron Kump, Johnny Mae, as you said, you got to kind of figure out how that's all going to work out there. And Michael Mokafisi was probably, if we're just being like who was best to worst of the 5 guys Utah had up front last year, I'd probably go with Mike Mokafisi for being the worst, just because he had so many of those down games where it felt like he really struggled with run blocking and also giving up some stuff in pass protection. Now, still had some good positives. This was an offensive line unit that was still good overall, but whenever you're ranking guys 1 to 5, someone's got to be at the bottom, and for me, that would have been Mokafisi. So it's definitely a group that there's a lot to see from. There are so many teams where their success is defined by their offensive line, whether it's in college football. We've seen that in the NFL for years, that teams like to get their quarterbacks on a cheap rookie deal so they can build around their offensive line. So that being the biggest question is a little bit of concern. But there's one thing, Dante, I think we both agree in that Jim Harding is a dang good offensive line coach. And this Utah offensive line still found a way to come together and provide some big protection for Cam Rising in the Pac-12 championship game against USC the first time around, when at that time USC was leading the country in sacks too. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this group looks. We expect them to all play together during the spring game this Saturday. So we'll definitely be on the lookout to see how those guys perform overall. But is there anyone else you think could use a really big week of spring practice, whether it's a position or a player?
Not necessarily. I think the team's pretty set in stone outside of a couple of things, just because so many guys are coming back and they've been dominant over the last couple of years, you know.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Once again, the spring game scheduled for this Saturday. One of the guys, as we mentioned, that the team is trying to replace is Clark Phillips III. And Clark was obviously very great for Utah, and now is going to be a very valuable for any NFL team who wants him. Yes, he might follow the first because of those height concerns, but Clark Phillips, as reported by Tom Pelissero, is very wanted by NFL teams because he has met with every NFL team apparently. And Clark is the kind of guy where as soon as you get into a room, you're going to absolutely fall in love with him. And I understand because of the size concerns about him being a number 1 corner in the NFL. I still think he's a guy who's capable of holding his own against some of the top receivers in the league. Look, some of those matchups, like a DeAndre Hopkins, would obviously be a little tough just because of his ability to, even if you play great coverage, come down with the ball just because of the height mismatch there. But Clark is such a great guy. He was such a great player for the Utes, an absolute ball hawk, and create turnovers. And as we said, just an outstanding human being too. So I guess it's not surprising that every team has met with him, especially because corner is such a position for need for basically every NFL team with how good the receivers are in today's game.
Yeah, most definitely. And you look back at that game that Clark had against Drake London back in 2021, Utah's first win in over 100 years at the Coliseum, and London he got his basically. But if you look at the film, Clark was right there with him, running with him, being physical against a guy who is 6'4", 6'5", much taller than Clark is. And even though Drake London is 6'4", 6'5", I mean, he still has insane lateral agility, insane lateral quickness. I mean, he's one of the best athletes from last draft class, and obviously was a top 10 pick to the Falcons. So I mean, seeing Clark go up against a player like that, who is pretty much everything that NFL scouts are fearing him going up against, those big, quick players who can just dominate you in terms of just boxing you out like a forward and getting a rebound or something like that, similar to what we see Mike Evans do, T. Higgins do, guys like that. I feel like that's the biggest concern for Clark Phillips, going against guys like that. But that film that he had against USC in 21, I think was a little bit more encouraging because, you know, Drake London, he was at USC for 3 years before that game. Clark Phillips was in his second year at Utah. The 2020 season doesn't really even count to begin with. So, I mean, that was really his first true season at Utah. And he put on a very good performance against Drake London. And obviously Utah ended up winning that game by a good amount of points. Drake London, like I said, he got his. But if you look at the film, Clark was right there, had some nice pass breakups against him. I mean, he had a very, very solid game against a great NFL receiver. So I think that's pretty encouraging. And that's something that hasn't really gotten talked about a whole lot. When you actually look at his production against those guys that NFL scouts are kind of scared of him going up against, it's not bad at all. I mean, you even look at Jackson Smith and Jigba. Clark had a nice pass break up against him. Obviously picked off CJ Stroud in the Rose Bowl, and also picked Jackson Smith and Jigba's pocket when he was running free for that easy touchdown and ended up fumbling. So, I mean, Clark has rose to the occasion pretty much every time Utah has asked him. I mean, you even look at the UCLA game last year. Jake Bobo scored a touchdown. Maybe he scored 2 touchdowns. But if he did score 2 touchdowns, those 2 catches were his only 2 of the game. In the open field, Clark had him in clamps. I mean, he played a great game then too, outside of those couple of lapses in the red zone when you're up against Jake Bobo, who's 6'5" again. So, I mean, he's had good performances against players that the NFL scouts are scared of. And when he gets in a room, his energy is just so infectious, and he's such like a easy person to talk to. We know, we've been to media before. So, I mean, he's just such a great character and a player that I think a lot of NFL teams could just simply use. His leadership in the locker room, how quick he is breaking on the ball. You could use him in the slot. You can use him out wide. He's not going to back down against anyone. He's got that bulldog fearless mentality. So, I mean, I think that he's going to fit in pretty much anywhere. It just comes down to what the other teams are kind of looking at in their corners, because there are some very good corners in this draft class. I think cornerback is by far the best position in this draft class. It doesn't even come close. There's like 10 or 11 guys that I think would be probably top 3 corners in like every other draft class. It's loaded. So it just comes down to each team's list of cornerbacks who they like the most. And I think Clark will kind of slot in that late second round, early mid third round range, because like we've said, I mean, the scouts are obviously a little bit worried about his height. I don't think it's as much of a concern as they're making me out to be, but it still obviously is a little bit concerning, because when you're going to that NFL level, you're going to be facing elite world-class athletes every single rep.
It's just important to remember, too, that so often these NFL GMs, they get caught up with traits or what guys don't test at or all those things, and you forget the tape sometimes. That's what happened with Orlando Brown of Oklahoma. He had one of the worst combines of all time, and now he's been a left tackle on a Super Bowl team, just got the bag from the Bengals. So that's a guy who you got to be – those are guys that you got to be very careful about, just believing all the hype about all the testing numbers when they have great tape. That's what Clark Phillips has. So hopefully an NFL team doesn't make a mistake. And yeah, I really hope he goes in the second round, but I think you're right, Dante. There is a chance, just because of those size concerns, that he could slip even to the third at this point. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch and see how it plays out. Just like it's going to be interesting to see how the rest of this week will play out for Utah spring football. Make sure you guys keep it here at Locked On Utes. We'll be going over some of the big recruit signings that Utah has landed, reacting to all the spring practice tomorrow. The media will be able to watch 20 minutes. Once again, it'll be the final time we're able to do so until the spring game this Saturday. So make sure you guys keep it here at Locked On Utes. Also, make sure you guys give Dante a follow at Dante Guardi on Twitter. Head over to UteZone to check out all the great content he's got churning up. Are you doing anything for the Utes in the NFL draft potentially, Dante?
Yeah, definitely will be. So last year I did a little like just Utah football fan guide to the NFL draft, just a little breakdown, predictions of where players are going to go, the best case scenario, worst case scenario, things like that. I'm going to be doing something similar for sure this time around with obviously all the players that have a possibility of getting drafted, that being Mahmoud Diabate, Braden Daniels, and obviously Dalton Kincaid, Clark Phillips, and et cetera, anyone else who might possibly have a chance, and just a little breakdown prediction, like I said. So definitely we'll be coming out with that. Definitely want to take a look at that, because a lot of good information and just some more like context and background before actually watching the NFL draft.
Make sure you guys go check out all that great stuff Dante has at UteZone.com. Dante, appreciate you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
We'll be back with more content on tomorrow's Locked On Utes.